Welcome to the Strategy Skills podcast. I'm your host, Chris Safarova, and our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. And today we have with us a very special guest, Laura Ries, who is a globally recognized marketing strategist and best-selling author. And I'm really looking forward to diving in. Welcome, Laura.
Well, thanks so much. It's exciting to be here. Can't wait to get into the discussion.
I would like to start our conversation today with an overview of your journey. Could you give us an overview of how you got where you are right now?
Yeah, well, it just so happens my father is Ries, and he pioneered this idea called positioning. And he wrote a very famous book called Positioning, the Battle for Your Mind, which really, revolutionized how we think about marketing and branding. And so getting into the business started with my dad. And I always was fascinated by what he did as a only child from his second marriage. We talked a lot about business at the dinner table. So I got to learn, and he loved to tell stories about what was going on with his clients. He loved to tell stories about, what he would advise companies to do. So anytime we watched a television show and the commercials came on, it was a running commentary. And so I got an early education on my branding and marketing 101. And, my journey then went to college. I worked for 1 year at an advertising agency in New York. And then I was like, what am I doing? I want to learn from the best. And so I went to work with my dad. And I like to say I was the ultimate apprentice. We spent nearly 3 decades together, and just a wonderful experience. We traveled the world. We wrote several books, worked with clients around the world. And he passed in 2022 at almost 96. And he was just an amazing person and amazing legacy, and was working until the very, very end. He just loved what he did. And, he put that passion into me. But the positioning idea, he was, not a nobody, but he was a small guy from a, midtown, Midwest family. He wanted to move to New York City to build and go into advertising. He started a firm in the 60s, and to position the firm was, and to become well known, they thought about, how can we approach our client work and establish our agency for standing for something. And that's where they came upon this idea of positioning. My father first called it the rock. Every ad should be centered on one indisputable truth that would be instantly understood and accepted by the consumer. And he and his partner, Jack Trout, they worked on that and came up with calling it positioning, or owning a position in the mind. And really was the contrast at the time was to go up against creativity, which was thought of as the ultimate way to build a brand, right? You just needed a somewhat, good product or service, and you use the creativity of the advertising to drive it into the mind. But you see, communications doesn't start with what you want to say. In fact, the flip side of what positioning taught us was that it first starts with the mind of the consumer, and what that mind is more, what open position or hole there is, and how to structure that message so that it would be instantly understood and then believed. So, that set, my dad's career on a path, and of course, me joining in and becoming into the family business, if you will, of positioning.
Such an incredible way to grow up.
Yeah,
basically,
for sure.
World's top MBA class every day. From the time you can even recognize people are moving around you when you're a tiny baby.
Yes, no, it was, I did not get an official MBA, but I like to say I got the absolute best MBA from my father and the world, real world experience out there. And, it's so fun to, we worked with clients, but also doing the research for the book, studying all the companies of what, success looks like, what mistakes look like, and how to best, structure principles to help other people apply them and become successful too.
Take us to those early days growing up with your dad. What were some key things you learned about positioning and how companies can be more successful?
Yeah, well, it comes from, the ultimate and most important principle is the idea of this focus, right? So standing for something starts with focusing in on one thing and not trying to be everything to everyone. And that's, a very important principle to think about and understand. And what's interesting too is, in my father's world, he ran an advertising agency for 30 years. And, that in the book and positioning was, to bring in business and get notoriety. But what ultimately happened was that they were asked for consulting. So big companies like Burger King, they didn't want to hire my dad's little B2B agency for, advertising, but they did want to talk to him about strategy. So by the mid 80s, their business was about 50-50, right? The consulting was, growing, but they also had the traditional B2B advertising business. And it just so happens, actually, he was giving a speech and someone said, hey, you're not following your own advice on focus, right? You're talking about telling us to do it. Why don't you do it yourself? And he actually took that really to heart. And he was like, you know what? You're right. We are, dividing ourselves. How can we promote ourselves as an advertising agency as well as consulting? And they conflicted with each other, right? The ad agency didn't want to, the people going for the ad agency felt, a bit slighted about the consulting side, and the consulting clients didn't want to be pushed into using the advertising agency. So he actually, in the late 80s, shut down the agency, giving up 50% of his income, right? 50% of the business and the sales. But because he was able to focus on consulting, that business grew. He became, and eventually I joined him just a few years later, becoming extremely well known on the consulting side and focusing on what we do. Listen, there's a lot of companies that can, pull off the advertising part of the business, but we think our focus and our expertise is more strongly aligned with the consulting and the advice on the positioning strategy. So, it's always important to sort of apply those principles to yourself. It can be actually challenging, but it's very effective when you do so.
Do you remember any stories from childhood that you feel comfortable sharing where you really learned something from your dad?
Oh, geez. I mean, I learned something every day. But what was really interesting, and I think what, kind of started this process was, working together on projects. So, as I got into high school and middle school, and, you'd have to have the project and you present in front of the class. And, we really spent a lot of time on these. He loved to help me, and I loved to learn on that, because what he taught me was, the importance of the visuals that went along with what you're trying to communicate. Most time the kid reads something in the front of the classroom, but for me and my dad, it was, I had flip charts, I had slides, I had dioramas, and, illustrating and visualizing those became incredibly important. And it taught me a lot in terms of, remembering that, to get a good visual, you also have to think oversimplification, right? How can you visualize it? What's the best way to present whatever you're trying to say in a more visual oriented way? And so that was a tremendous learning opportunity. And, seeing the way my dad gave speeches, back before there was computers and PowerPoint, he was creating, all of these visual, 35 millimeter slides, and took a lot of time. And at that time, a lot of money to create these. But we traveled the world with, multiple carousels and thousands of slides, along with the presentations that we were doing. So, we were really ahead of the game, and, moving into a visual oriented world, which, I think is ultimately very important right now.
Laura, and when your dad decided, I'm going to kill half of the business and just focus, what happens then? What were some of the challenging moments and how he was able to overcome it?
Yeah, sure. Well, he was very thoughtful, and his agency was like his family. He had many people that had been with him for a very long time, were very loyal, were terrific. And he actually was very mindful of that. And so he made it a 2-year process. So giving those people plenty of time to look for other opportunities, as well as their clients, right? To look for a new agency. So he was really mindful of that process and that transition, to help give those people, a jump start on the next phase of their career. And so that was incredibly important. And then, interestingly enough, too, because the agency was in New York City, and they felt, to make a clear break from the agency Madison Avenue world of New York, they located the consulting business in Greenwich, right? So just that physical address, as well as the change in the company structure, was also really important to communicate to the world that they were in fact, serious consultants. That was a location kind of known for that, a city just outside of the city. So giving, enormous availability to our clients and being able to travel around the world. field. So that was also really important. But, he also really enjoyed the ability. And one of our differences is we love to work directly with the client. So, we're not pawning it off on some junior executive. We're always in the meeting together. And so not having the big agency and having to manage people, that really allowed him to do more work with clients and be more direct contact with clients. And that was, his greatest skill set.
So what happens once you join? So you graduate, then you work for 1 year, and you decide, no, I'm going to work with my dad. What happens?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, at that time, he and Jack were together, and, we decided that, we would, I would join him, and, Jack went off and did, the same thing, consulting, but then, it was just he and I in the business, which is, really a wonderful, partnership of being with him. And, truly, I mean, the first 10 years, I was the ultimate apprentice, right? I was a young kid in my 20s. I was learning. And at that time, he was just writing the book Focus. So really, as I said, most important principle of positioning is focus. And he felt it was really important to write a detailed book on that, of how it incredibly improves company performance, both in the brand as well as on the financial side, making it more, attractive and successful on that end. So I spent a lot of time with the research. Again, back then, it was just the dawn of computers. That book came out in 96. So I had to write all the companies asking for their annual reports so he could get all the data and information. It's so much easier now. But so I did spend a lot of time with that. And of course, going with him on client meetings and participating in all of that. And it was wonderful. I mean, really, a great head start in that. And then, as there's 3 decades of our work together, and the second decade, we were more, even partners, and it was, incredibly fun to. And he was appreciative. It is very helpful to have a partner, and we complement each other, right? Of course, he had more decades of experience than me, and he was a male, and he had different experiences through his life. And I was younger, I was female, I was more in touch. I just got married, having kids, bringing all of those things together. So it's really nice to be able to bring that with into the business and into our lives, and in working with clients and speeches, and bringing in the influences of new brands, new technologies, and of course media. We were very early on in jumping on the internet. I was always a computer geek, fascinated by it. So that was a great addition to what we were doing.
And during those first 10 years or first few years, what were some of the most challenging things for you, and how did you overcome them?
It's kind of funny, but I mean, going from calling him Dad to Al, I mean, in meetings, you don't want to be like Dad. So, it was more of a professional, it just sounded right in terms of a meeting in front of people. And so I would call him Al. And, we took our relationship to really a next level. I mean, we were always dad and daughter, but we were also business partners. And, listen, I was still very young at the beginning, but, he treated me, with such respect. And of course, he was also grateful that I took on the bookkeeping, the accounting, all of the, business details, so he could focus on writing the books and doing other things. So, but yeah, you have to work together. I mean, you are a partner, and as a father and daughter team, that dynamic is, it's not the same as when you were a kid living at home. You're today in a business, and it was great.
Do you remember your first international trip? Where did you go, and what was surprising for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was fortunate enough that, my dad, when I was a kid, had taken me on a few trips, and it was a great experience. And I remember it had to have been the first one, but he had a big meeting at Nestle in Switzerland, and I got to go with him, and I was super excited. And we got to Switzerland to get this big meeting. And I do remember we sat down with the executives, and they ordered this big plate of carpaccio. I'm a vegetarian. And I was horrified. And, I mean, it was like, oh my gosh, she's not going to eat it. And, it was a little embarrassing, but they were very sweet. But, being able to see my dad, on stage, giving speeches in that environment as a kid, it was, overwhelming. And I was so proud of him. And to see any parent on the stage like that is truly exciting. And he was amazing. So, seeing as a kid and, then into when I started working with him, as I said, we're always passionate about presentations. And I was always practicing with him when I was in high school and, even in college. And so that really came very naturally. And, he was so, giving and allowing me to take on the stage with him. And, it took practice. I mean, he always gave me notes on how to improve, how to slow down my speaking as I'm probably speaking too fast. And he would say, pause. Wait. And so that was, it's tremendously valuable to have someone giving you that input and really being a mentor in so many ways.
And looking back, how did this global exposure, because you have been consulting across 60 countries,
yeah,
how did it change your perspective on what truly differentiates a brand?
Sure. I think I'm so fortunate to have had the opportunity to travel the world as I have. Did some when I was a kid, but really took off when in my career, being able to take these business trips and work with clients and doing speeches. And it really does open your eyes to really, there's so many similarities around the world. Well, the cultures are different and the language is different, the climate's different, but, people, the minds are the same, right? The challenge of branding is getting a brand name and getting, owning a position in the mind. And so you do need to understand the local market, but there is a great global mind, if you will. I mean, today, as we have so many global brands, we have the shared of experience of what McDonald's is, what Coca-Cola is, what Microsoft is, what iPhone is. And, to see that and see how those brands, are more similar than not around the world is really important. And not only that, it's also the opportunity. So when you go to a small country and to see, well, even in a small country, whether, it's Finland, for example, or Sweden, these are small geographic countries, but we have some of the greatest global brands from there, right? Nokia, you've got IKEA. So the opportunity is not just to stay in your local country, but to think about how you can narrow the focus and take that idea around the world. And that is, the challenge is when you're in a small country, companies tend to become unfocused because the country is so small. So you have to remember when going global, you have to narrow that focus, sometimes even more. And truly why the, success of huge countries, like the US or even China, because you have our market is so big, our brands tend to be more narrowly focused, which translates a lot easier when going global.
Laura, and for our listeners who haven't studied marketing and so on, branding, could you explain in more detail what is positioning?
Sure. Well, first of all, you should check out some of our books because we nail it down, and there's so many great examples. But the concept of brand is, most people think marketing is done out there. It's all about the marketplace, but the real battle is the mind itself. And to think about how that brand is perceived and understood in the mind, and the power is in owning a singular idea. And the even more powerful thing is to dominate and own a category. Because, while people talk in brands, they really think in categories. The category is king, if you will. And so because, look in the mind, think about electric vehicles, right? Is people aren't that excited about the Tesla brand. They're excited because Tesla dominates the category of electric vehicle in the mind of the consumer. So the power lies in, and that's where understanding the mind and positioning is so critical for companies and particularly for leaders. One challenge in a company is you fall in love with your brand. And for a company, their brand name is the sweetest word they've ever heard. And the idea that they think that putting that name on anything will make it successful. But that's not true because the brand itself, as I said, is connected to the category. And you have a brand like Kodak, for example. one of the most powerful brands at one point in the world. And the company loved the brand. They thought it stood for quality. What they didn't realize is no, it stood for film photography. And so when they tried to launch Kodak into the digital world, they had the technology. They were the first company to, invent and pioneer the first, digital camera. But unfortunately, they gave it the Kodak name. And that was a perception problem in the mind. It wasn't a product problem. It was a positioning problem. What they should have done is given it a new brand name. And you see that successfully done with many companies around the world. For example, Toyota, dominated, reliable, affordable cars. And when they wanted to go upscale, they didn't call them Honda Super, Deluxe, or Toyota Super Deluxe. They called it a Lexus. And Honda did the same thing, right? They had a new brand for the expensive version, which is a very good strategy for companies to use. If you want to go into a new category, a new brand is necessary.
You recently wrote the book. Congratulations. For someone who will read the book, what would you like them to take away from the book?
Well, you saw it's behind me, but it's called The Strategic Enemy. I'm super proud and excited. And it really relates to positioning itself. As I talked about a few minutes ago, the concept positioning took off because they identified the strategic enemy. At that time, they called out creativity, right? Instead of using creativity to build brands, you should use the strategy of positioning, of looking inside the mind and standing for one singular idea, being first in a category and dominating that. But what I realized in working with clients is, too often they think about themselves, and no one, picks one brand in isolation. And when you contrast your brand to a strategic enemy, it is much more clear what you stand for by first defining what you're not. And that contrast is what can bring clarity and better understanding. You see, the mind understands, opposition faster than superiority. I mean, most companies are just talking about we're better. But that's not believable. You saying you're great, nobody's going to believe that. But instead, if you first contrast how your brand is different than a strategic enemy, it instantly sets up the discussion for, well, how is your brand different and how does that make it better? And so the strategic enemy is that oppositional force that your brand or category stands against. And it could be a competitor, but it also could be another category. It could be a convention. It could be a concept, but it's something in contrast to you to make the understanding of your brand more clear. For example, you have Walmart, right? The low cost leader in retail, always low prices at Walmart. They dominate the category. How do you compete against that? Well, not by being better, but by being different. And that is exactly what Target did, and Target, as we call it, cheap chic, right? It's the same kind of store, the same kind of merchandise, but it's has a little bit more of a style associated with it. The stores are cleaner and brighter, and things have, design. They bring in designers and everything's just a little bit better. And that clear differentiation is what set up Target to build a very strong and be a very strong competitor to the leader Walmart.
So if we look at an example, for example, we take Harvard Business Review, what would be their strategic enemy?
Their strategic enemy. Well, I mean, here's a couple of things. One, if you're the leader, that's your anchor. And most times, people are coming against it. I mean, for the Harvard Business Review, I mean, they're going against, people like me that are writing, books and, different articles and concepts of, more direct approach with, not so high level. I mean, I make books that are readable, that are approachable, that have fun, entertainment value along with it. So, there's always a different way of doing things. And here's the thing. There's not one right way or wrong way. I mean, the way I write my books is, one way, and I think it's great. But how, the Harvard Business approach does it and writes their articles is a different way, right? It's more of a, at the university level and all of these things. So there's never one way to do it. There's always the contrast to something else. And for Harvard, what do they have going for it? Leadership. How did they establish leadership? They were the first university, and that goes a very long way. And the real challenge is, how do you become a leader if you're the Poughkeepsie Business Journal? It's a little bit tougher. They've got a tremendous challenge. What other universities should do is narrow the focus and stand for technology or marketing, like Northwestern. Those are good approaches to compete against with a leader like the Harvard Business Review.
So if we take a publication that is competing with Harvard Business Review, what would be an example of a strategic enemy for them? Would it be Harvard Business Review or something else?
Sure.
And you can pick any publication you want.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing. When you're competing against a leader, the best strategy is to narrow the focus, to talk on one topic or one region, right? It could be a country, it could be a city, or it could be, as I mentioned, technology or marketing. There's different ways to approach that. And by being a specialist, that way, you can stand for that idea and be the go-to publication for any of these things, whether it's an entrepreneur approach, magazine, or a big company top management approach. There's always ways to, slice it up and figure out what you can focus on and stand for.
So then for them, if we take someone who is very niched, for them, the strategic enemy will be the general publications that don't go deep enough on the topic?
Sure. Yeah. No. Yeah. You always, that being a specialist sets you up to lead in that category, and the generalists, of course, are the enemy. And leadership is so powerful. And when you can, dominate and become the leader in any given category, that really does, set you up for success. And again, it's not just, the reality of your leadership. It's also, the perception of it in the mind. And so that's incredibly important to drive that. And how do you do that? Well, one way is public relations. For any company or a publication, think about Vogue. Why do we mostly know Vogue? Well, Anna Wintour, right? The editor-in-chief becoming a world famous for that magazine and talking about it, because, a publication can't give your interviews or do much talking, but a person can. And so, you see around the world, successful companies also have very well-known and famous CEOs. And, we know the names of, Jensen Huang at NVIDIA, for example, or Elon Musk, of course, at Tesla. That's an incredibly important part of any positioning strategy.
So if someone listening to us right now and they're still struggling to identify strategic enemy, maybe you can elaborate a little more for them.
Well, I mean, it is what your brand stands against. And, what it takes to stand against something is by focusing on something. There's many examples you can think of. How did Salesforce establish itself? Well, yeah, they were the first cloud CRM platform, but they didn't initially talk about that. They wouldn't talk about, what they were, better at. Instead, they identified the enemy. They had to knock out the enemy of getting you to stop using software. And no software, the end of software, was there a message going up against that strategic enemy to say, this is not the way to do it. We have a different way using the cloud and building, the CRM this way that is going to have ultimate results. So, knowing what you stand against is incredibly important, but it does require focus. And that's something a lot of companies don't like to do. But when you can do it, that's a great way to, build the company. It also can help with, figuring out your brand name, finding a name when you have a focus. For example, we have the dog food brand Farmer's Dog, one of the leaders in this notion of human grade, food for dogs. And they call out their strategic enemy, which was dry food. Now, I fed my dog dry food for years. I thought it was the best thing for my little Cocoa Puff. But, Farmer's Dog has educated me, if you will, by naming their strategic enemy they call burnt brown balls. It is processed food, dry dog food, and eating processed food every meal of your life is not good for people, and it's not good for dogs either. And that was a very strong message in building their brand, not just by communicating how great their food was, although that's a part of the message, but also communicating what they stand against, what they're not, and what you should stop doing, and making that contrast very simple and very clear. But focus as I mentioned, is so important. Another great example is Subaru. Much like my dad's company back in the 80s, it was 50-50. They had 50% of their business in two-wheel cars and 50 in four-wheel. And they invented, or they call it all-wheel drive vehicles, but they didn't focus on it. And because they didn't, they had messages, they couldn't go very strongly in one direction or the other. But then they weren't doing well is what happened. And the CEO got fired. The new guy came in and said, we're going to focus. And they dropped 50% of the business and the car line and focused only on all-wheel drive and had one of the most, remarkable turnarounds in automotive history. And today is well established. What is that four-wheel drive? It's about adventure, right? I'm not sure how many go off-road, but people, associate something very specific and very strongly with Subaru. And here's the thing. At the time, that maybe wasn't such a big category. And, in the South, we didn't really ever think about buying, four-wheel drive cars. It's, it snows once every 10 years, right? But Subaru was able to grow the category. And that's the big opportunity to have that narrow focus. You could call it a niche, but to have it, stand for it, and then expand the interest by being the leader into that category itself. And that's exactly what Subaru did and continues to do. And of course, now in Atlanta, where I live, you see Subarus all over because people want that brand. They identify with that brand and, feel very, love to drive it around town.
Laura, so for our listeners who, let's say they run a company that is not focused in how you define focused, maybe they're very diligent and they do incredible job for the customers type of focused, but they have a lot of different things. So for someone who doesn't want to just cut all that business away and no longer serve those customers, is there another way?
First of all, it is very important to understand that there is power in focus, right? Not, being able to see that and understand it, and not thinking that expansion is the route to success, in all directions and putting your name on everything, for example. What is important to think about is, when you talk about focus, the message is very important, meaning you don't have to communicate everything that you sell. Many companies do this. Particularly think about B2B. Your biggest strategy or the reason for the marketing you do, the website you develop is to get new customers, new prospects. And the best way to do that is oversimplify the message and to focus on something. What's that first thing? Now, once you have a customer, sure, can you sell them other things? Absolutely. But being known and standing for and driving your marketing communications on one idea is a much better approach. Yet most people think, in running a company, they treat the different divisions like kids and we got to be, give an equal marketing budget to everybody. Now, when you have kids, you should, treat all your kids fairly and the same, but not true in a company. And you should pick that one to focus on. Think about Smoothie King. I love this brand. They invented the words and the idea of what a smoothie is. And for decades, they refocused on healthy and revamped the menu recently and has had tremendous success. But unfortunately, they think, what else can we get into? And they launched things like smoothie bowls and even now some like toast and avocado toast. Now, should they have smoothie bowls? I don't know. Sure. But what they shouldn't do is make that the biggest message and all the billboards and all the attention going to it. The opportunity for them is to drive the idea that a smoothie is better than fast food. It's portable, it's convenient, it's healthy. There's so many powerful reasons that differentiates them. And they are, after all, their name is Smoothie King. They're the leader in it. And again, once you're in there, if you have a few bowls on the menu, sure. But I think driving in the one message instead of, listen, the world has too many messages out there. If you yourself have multiple messages, it's unlikely you're going to be remembered. Focusing in on that one message and repeat. We see the brands that have had the most success by the repetition of that message, right? BMW and the ultimate driving machine. Chick-fil-A, right? Telling us to eat more chicken with the cows. They didn't do that for 6 months. They've done it for 30 years. More companies need to think in that direction of understanding what that focus is and then using that repetition, finding, for example, that visual hammer, a way to visualize your positioning strategy so that you can combine refine it to make it even more memorable, even more, emotional in that connection.
Laura, and when you work with clients, what process do you use to pressure test a proposed brand enemy?
You got to talk it out. I mean, marketing is as much an art as it is a science. And so the scientific part about it is understanding the perceptions that are in the minds of the prospects, the minds of consumers, the customers, for example. And so that's the scientific process that we work through. But there is an art to, not just, there's probably lots of enemies, figuring out which is the enemy we want to contrast from, and how to, make that clear. And it is just an art of having the experience of doing it with so many clients, seeing, a lot of the time spent with clients is talking about analogies of how things worked with other companies and other similar type of situations, and why, our books are filled with so many of the case histories. It's much easier to understand the principles when you see how they're applied in other situations, and then you can look back on yourself and, with a consultant to guide you, or really it's the outsider's perspective that I think is very helpful for any company to have as a part of a strategic type of meeting, because they're so close to it. It's very hard to understand how, your company is perceived by someone who, thinks about it for, a few minutes or is introduced to it instantly. What is their initial, reaction, that gut feeling? And that's where, a consultant or, just as I said, an outsider, trusted advisor or friend can help you give that perspective. But yes, I mean, it's the art of knowing it's right.
Laura, and what are your thoughts on using AI in helping you select your strategic enemy and other things related to positioning?
Well, I mean, I think AI is a very interesting tool. I mean, it's a little, we had the internet come on and you could Google things and you could get great information. And now AI kind of synthesizes that and can spit back, different ideas, different thoughts. It can, bring things together for you and look up and research and summarize it. So, I use it all the time. I think it is a tremendous tool, but I don't think what it helps me to put on things in the page that I can identify the right answer. I think, again, in terms of, different areas, I mean, math is easy, not easy. It can be very hard, but math is simple. It follows rules all the time. And 2 + 2 is always 4. In marketing, it's not so. And in fact, in marketing, we like to say, 2 + 2, or 1 + 1 or 2 + 2 almost diminishes. Like adding too many things is, less is more sometimes, meaning less things you have, the more powerful you become. So, being able to have AI be a tool and then use that information to help you make the better decision. I think there's a great human element that is still incredibly valuable in knowing what the focus is, and then, as well convincing people of it.
And given the technological changes, advancements that are happening, for our listeners, what do you think are the skills they need to really focus developing and strengthening?
I do think there is, what's interesting about AI is it can, quickly, summarize and give you information, but there's still tremendous value in spending the time and really deep diving into the background and stories and companies and getting immersed into it. I think you can learn a lot through that process. And continuing to read books, right? With AI, you can get summaries of everything, but I think there is true value in reading whole text and reading full articles and listening to full interviews. The real talk, listening and getting the raw information and data to be able to, come to your own conclusions, I think is still incredibly valuable. And then also having the tool that, as on the side to be able to summarize it as well, and using them in combination, I think can make us all more productive.
Laura, and if you had to prescribe 3 immediate actions for a founder launching a new brand, let's say that they're launching it this upcoming week, what would they be?
Sure. If you're launching a new brand, first of all, what's the category? Make sure that you know exactly what the category is. And if possible, can we position this as a new category that you're pioneering, with the old category being that strategic enemy? Next, is the name right? I think, many times, founders are, they want to get the product right, the service right, and that's incredibly important. But the naming is incredibly important, because that's how things are verbalized, and making sure that, it's easy to say, it connects to the positioning idea. It's not too generic. For example, there's another company that competes with Farmer's Dog. It's called the Fresh Pet. That's a too generic a name. It doesn't sound like a brand name, right? It sounds like a generic category. So the strength is in having a brand name that can, stand for that category, but also be seen as a brand name itself. So you got to think about the category. You got to think about the brand name, and then who are we fighting against? Who is our strategic enemy? And being able to, say what our focus is and what we stand against, so that we can make, and make our brand worth fighting for.
Anything else you would like to share about your work that you wish I asked you and I haven't?
No, I mean, I think it's, I love what I do. And that's, I think, important for anyone in the world to find passion in what you do. And that allows you to just, you've got to spend the hours doing it. And I think, what I have learned is I know so much more after having done this for decades, and I still have more to learn. I mean, you can never take away that learning mindset, of, there's still new things to learn about. We've got AI, so we're all trying to learn that, and master it. And so that's a challenge that brings to every day. So, but no, thank you. I think for everyone, my only ask is check out my book. I think it can be a great tool in helping you build your brand, by understanding not just what you stand for, but also by figuring out what you can stand against.
And I want to wrap up with my favorite question, stepping away from this discussion. Over your entire lifetime, what were 2-3 aha moments, realizations that really changed the way you look at life or the way you look at business?
Well, I mean, I go back to my favorite story of, my dad wrote Positioning. I was about 9 when that book came out, and, he gave me the second copy. I've got it signed behind me. And when I was a kid, I threw it on the shelf. I didn't think about it. But in middle school, I picked up the book, and I don't even remember why, but I was like, oh, I should read this book my dad wrote. And it blew me away. It changed how I, changed the trajectory of my whole life, obviously. It got me interested in a deeper way of the concept of positioning, connecting even, to my father in a new way, seeing how he was able to write these stories and write the case studies, which were so fascinating and interesting. So, that was the big, aha moment of my life that, I often reflect on of how that really changed everything. It was from that moment on and reading that book that, I truly did want to dedicate my life to doing this. And it just became that unreally spoken thing between my dad and I that, I would eventually go into the business in some way and take it on into a new generation.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else you want to share? Where can people buy your book?
Yeah, of course. It is available where books are sold, but you can get all the information on our website. It's just Ries.com, RIES. You can sign up for our free newsletter. We've got links to information about all our books, as well as the life and legacy of my great and wonderful father, Al Ries. So check it out.
Our guest today has been Laura Ries. Explore her new book, The Strategic Enemy. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'm looking forward to connect with you all next time.